Hello everybody and welcome back to Oxy Not Included. In today's episode we're going to be taking a look at all the farming options that you have in the game, the various food and utility crops that you can grow, your cooking options, the technologies associated with all this stuff, and just making a rough pass look at what are the requirements for each of these things and whether or not it's worth it, not worth it, or what circumstances should you be growing these things, and sort of some rough ideas, just rough sketch of the challenges that you would face in pursuing each of these different crops as something that you make a core part of your base. A few disclaimers before I start. Number one, your mileage is going to vary, in particular when it comes to the food crops, because a lot of players are going to manage morale very differently, and a lot of the advantage of harvesting higher tier foods is that they give better morale boosts to your duplicants. If you're meeting your morale requirements in some other fashion, right, either through rooms that are specialized to give your duplicants more morale, or stress reduction, just forget managing the morale, just manage the stress, or you have recreational buildings to improve morale, or you just have more downtime for your duplicants. There are a lot of different ways to manage morale in the game. If you're using one of those, you might find that having food as a solution to these morale requirements isn't really that important. So things will vary in that end as well. But also your mileage is going to vary because you're going to start off on different asteroids a lot of the time. Not everyone's going to start on the basic default asteroid, and therefore the conditions, the irrigation requirements, the fertilization requirements, the temperature and atmosphere requirements of each of these plants might be easier or harder to meet. We'll try and cover that in the video. Another disclaimer is that even though this video is being made only 2 days before the game releases, there is still a pretty good chance that a lot of this stuff will change. Clay has expressed an interest in changing the balance of the game after its release, and probably will make a few balance changes even before the game releases. So even though I really can't delay on making this video any longer, if I want it to be out in time for new players to be able to make some use out of it, just keep in mind that before you take anything in this video as sort of super face value, especially if you're watching this video like a year in the future or something, check the description below. I'm going to try and keep an updated list of all the things that they've changed, all the things they've buffed or nerfed, and how that impacts sort of my assessment of whether or not something is good. So keep that in mind. Before you continue and say, oh, the video told me this, it must absolutely be right. Things can change, and I'm going to try and keep track of those changes in the description below, so keep that in mind. Okay, so let's get to the video. Oh, one other disclaimer as well. I'm not covering ranching options in this video. Ranching is like a huge topic in and of itself, and I've been working on an idea for a video for that for a long time, just showing off all sorts of really cool ranch ideas. Ranches are sort of a system that you need to design a lot of the time, right? How do you set up an aquarium? How do you set up this ranch? How do you set up a ranch for Drecos or glossy Drecos or this and that? And ranches also have sort of alternate purposes. You might have a ranch for Drecos that isn't really intended to produce a lot of food. It does, but might be more for producing a lot of plastic or thimbleweed fiber, something like that. Or you have a hatch ranch, which is designed to produce coal, but also produces some meat, or so on and so forth, right? You want more lime, you want more eggshell, you want more whatever. Ranches are going to be a whole separate topic. We're just going to be looking at the crops today, so keep that in mind. Number one, your mileage may vary because base needs vary and base playstyles vary too. Game information might change. Hopefully it doesn't. Hopefully this video will not immediately become obsolete. Clay, please don't do that to me, but it is a possibility, and if it does happen, I will put down in the description what has changed. And three, keep in mind, we're not looking at ranching options, and ranching options are a big part of how you can satisfy the food requirements for your base. Keep that in mind. Look out for my ranching videos later. But let's get into the various food options that you have in the game, and let's start off with just some of the basics. There are 3 different ways that you can plant crops in the game if you're not using pips to kind of plant the crops for you. Pips are these little squirrel type creatures that grab a seed and slap it into the ground, and it'll start growing sort of in a wild form. If you want domesticated crops that are going to grow 4 times as fast as a wild crop, you're limited to really 3 things, and those are planter boxes, farm tiles, and hydroponic farms. Each has sort of their advantages and disadvantages. The planter box is the first basic option that you unlock. And it has the advantage of something that you can get out really quickly because it only requires that first rung of research in order to reach it, right? If I go to research right here, right, basic farming unlocks the planter box, meal preparation unlocks the farm tile, agriculture unlocks the hydroponic farm. Pretty simple. So lowest tier of research gets you the planter box. The advantage of it, in a sense, is that it can be off the ground. The planter box itself does not count as a tile, so water will fall through it, gas will fall through it, all sorts of stuff like that. That's kind of an advantage in some circumstances. The disadvantage is it has no automation really associated with it. You can't pump irrigation in through it. It has a decor malice around it. So if I go to decor overlay here and I check out, say, this, right, I get a decor value of -10 in an area around this planter box because duplicants don't like looking at it. There's no decor malice from the farm tile. There is a small decor malice from the hydroponic farm, -2.5, whereas this one is -10. So keep that in mind. The decor values are different for these various things. But the main advantage of the planter box is easy to get out really quickly because it's low on the research tier sort of chain, and does not count as a tile, so air and liquid can pass through it. That upside is also kind of a downside, though, because sometimes you want your farm tiles and hydroponic farms, you want whatever you're farming to be part of the floor, like I've done down here with these. That way duplicants can walk on them, and you can have more compact farms as a result, right? If this is growing some crop that grows too high, then I need to put my roof right here. Whereas with this farm tile, if this farm tile was part of the floor, the roof could be down one more tile, and the duplicants would still be able to walk through. So if you don't want gas and liquid and duplicants to be able to, pass through here, the farm tile is your option. And the farm tile also doesn't have that decor malice associated with it, so this makes more compact farms easier. Then you have the hydroponic farm. The hydroponic farm has the advantage that it can accept liquids in as an irrigation. So it has an input, right, which will accept liquids where you can irrigate this crop automatically. Your duplicants will not have to schlep a bunch of stuff over to this area. It will still require delivery of fertilizer to this crop by either some sort of robotic process or by duplicant labor, but it won't require the movement of that liquid, which is really efficient. So this will allow for some degree of automation. And also the hydroponic farm is necessary for building the crops that grow upside down, right? So the Pincha pepper plant, I should say, and the Dasha saltvine will grow downwards. Therefore, you need to have a hydroponic farm, which is the only thing that can orient itself in that direction in order to grow this stuff. So keep that in mind. This grows all the crops. These don't. This has a little bit of a decor malice, but allows for automation to work with it. This doesn't allow for automation, but doesn't have the decor malice. And then this one has the upside downside of not being a tile. So there are pros and cons associated with that. Your food preparation technology, I've included the egg cracker here, even though this is more of a ranching thing, but whatever. Your basic food preparation technologies are going to be the microbe musher, the electric grill, and the gas range. Your lower tier foods are usually going to be either things that you eat raw or things that are processed through the microbe musher. Your middle tier foods are going to be things that you process through the electric grill usually, and then your highest end foods are going to be things that you process through the gas range. The gas range requires natural gas as a fuel. These require electricity. All of them are going to require some degree of a duplicant operation and supply to these various buildings. They also require different levels of cooking in order to operate. So keep that in mind, that you kind of need to train a duplicant to be able to operate these things as well. But what do I mean by like high tier, low tier, middle tier? What does that mean? And by when I talk about high tier, low tier, middle tier, I'm talking about the amount of morale bonus that you get from each of these foods. So here we have sort of the lowest tier, the terrible foods that give a morale bonus of -1, so a morale malice actually. Most of these things are things that you're not going to farm. Hexafruit, I'm not sure why this just kind of goes off the page, but hexafruit and muckroot are things that you just kind of find around the map. They're one-time use sort of things. Likewise, nutrient bars are just something that you kind of start off with or you find in vending machines somewhere. Mush bars are something that you don't really farm. They're just a combination of dirt and water that you can make in the micro musher. They're pretty terrible. Meat is just something that drops from dead critters. And meal lice are really the only thing on here in this terrible rung that you're able to grow. So keep in mind that not all these foods are going to be grown foods, but this is just a bunch of like raw, bad ingredients, right? And they give a morale -1 to anybody who eats them, basically. Then we have sort of the morale neutral foods: raw lettuce, raw bristleberry, raw mushroom. These are all morale 0. Then we have cooked bristleberry, which becomes gristleberry. And we have cooked mushroom, fried mushroom, which we get just from the mushroom, right? This is our +1 morale tier. Then we have raw fish fillets, We have omelets, which are made from cooked eggs, frost buns, which are made from cooked sleet wheat grains, tofu, which is made from cooked nosh beans. We have sushi, cooked fish, berry sludge, barbecue. Berry sludge is basically the highest thing we're going to be able to get out of the microbe musher. This is basically mashing up a combination of bristleberry with sleet wheat, and has sort of the added bonus of never decaying, never spoiling. It's sort of a play on fruitcakes, right? The decay rate of foods is not particularly important because you're probably going to keep everything in a sterile or refrigerated environment, so you don't really need to worry about it too much. But I guess if you are running a base that has problems with that, this is something to consider. But this is sort of this next tier food, which gives a morale bonus of +8. Notice that this wasn't perfectly linear, right? That this is a morale bonus of +8, this is morale bonus of +4, but then this is morale +1, this is morale 0, this is morale -1. There's a feature, it's either gourmet or I forget what the other one is, but there's an attribute that a duplicate can have, or not an attribute, either a negative trait or a positive trait that a duplicate can have, which will either move them up or down automatically one tier on this sort of ladder. And that can be a big deal. That can take them from, +8 to +4, and they lose 4 morale because they're a gourmet who just kind of turns up their noses a lot of food. Or it could be a small deal, right? In fact, if they consume something that has -1 morale, the gourmet still doesn't care, right? The gourmet just moves down one tier, but is still at the lowest tier, or just only moves them down 1 morale. Like they eat raw lettuce, but they think it's just as bad as just eating raw meat, right? So this sort of whether or not you move up or down a rung is kind of going to vary, and also just gives you an idea that things aren't quite linear, right? We're going +1, +4. This next one is +8. The next tier is +12. Stuffed berries, mushroom wraps, and surf and turf. And then we have the next tier, which is +16. And we kind of have a tier after that, which is really only relevant for the gourmet guys. Again, they'll go down a tier but still get morale +16. Most other guys will be able to eat anything and be perfectly fine. Again, there's also a positive trait, which lets them move up a tier, I believe. I don't remember what it's called, so I could be completely wrong, but keep that in mind. So the Frostburger also has the benefit of a soul food buff, which is kind of a buff, kind of a mouse actually. It gives them a 15% stress reduction per cycle, but also gives them -2 to their athletics. So when they eat a Frostburger, they become really full and really happy, but they're going to move around your base a little bit slower as a result. So when they say it's the best food, it is in a tier all by itself, right? It's the only like +6 tier food, but it's got some downsides as well. So in any case, that's what I mean by these higher tier foods, lower tier foods. Basically, these 6 foods right here are all going to be prepared in the gas range. Most of these others are going to be prepared right in the sort of middle tier, are either going to be like really high quality ingredients like paku fillets, or they're going to be something that you prepare at the electric grill. And a lot of your lower end stuff, right, like mush bars or lice loaf, which is one that I don't even have on here, are going to be made at the micro musher. So keep that in mind. Typically speaking, low quality, mid quality, high quality, and sort of increasing requirements for each of these things. Power-wise, there isn't really a kind of corresponding thing, right? But the gas range is going to require natural gas as an input, which is kind of a tricky resource to get your hands on. So keep that in mind. These are the basic technology that we're talking about when preparing food, and that's basically what I mean when I talk about the various tiers of food, right? Higher tier foods just means higher morale foods. Whether or not that's important to your base, whether or not you need to get more morale out of your food is going to vary depending upon how you've kind of set up your base. But just keep that in mind. These are the technologies. Then let's discuss sort of your food crop options. Mealwood is the most basic. You're going to have access to it on pretty much every map. It's pretty forgiving in terms of all the conditions that it grows in. Body temperature anywhere between 10 and 30 degrees, which is where a lot of your starting biomes are going to start. Atmosphere is as long as you have 150 grams of pressure and it's oxygen, polluted oxygen, or carbon dioxide, which are a lot of the basic things you're going to have in your base at the start of the game. Works perfectly fine. The only requirement it has, if you want to domesticate it, is 10 kilograms of dirt per cycle. Dirt is usually pretty dirt cheap, and in fact, it's even more dirt cheap these days now that there's sort of a late game way of making renewable dirt. So mealwood is the go-to for most people at the early game, and I've seen a lot of players just continue growing mealwood throughout the entire game, right? As long as they have access to dirt, they just keep growing mealwood because they plan on meeting all their morale requirements later. There's really not many other downsides besides the morale requirements for this food. Dirt is a very plentiful resource. Um, Arguably, the shorter life cycle means that you're going to have to harvest it more often, which means a little bit more duplicate labor. But you don't even really need to spend duplicate labor on harvesting some of these crops. There's some tricks to farming. One of them is that you can just let a crop sort of naturally drop its food, right? So after 4 cycles of being ripe, it'll just automatically drop its food on the ground where it can be picked up by some sort of automated system. So that's something to keep in mind. You can also grow these things wild, right? So all these requirements that these food crops are going to have, the fertilization and irrigation requirements could be ignored if you're willing to put up with what is essentially a 4-time longer growth cycle, right? So that's going to be a trait of all these crops. You can have them domesticated, and they'll grow at 1/4 the speed, or 1/4 the length of life cycle of the wild life cycle, right? They're going to grow at 4 times the speed of a wild growing plant, but it requires you to put in some resources in order to grow them at that speed. So keep that in mind. If you want to grow your crops in a sort of a wild fashion, there's a creature called a pip, and the pip will grab seeds and plant them in any nearby available soil, or really anything that isn't like abyssalite. So if you have sort of a natural area and you have access to pips because you're in a forest biome, and you can just take the seeds and put them there, and your duplicants will be able to benefit from having wild grown dupes. Apologies for my cat, who is very upset for some reason, just meowing at a wall. Usually she sees something that she thinks is a bug and is very upset that she can't get to it. Sorry for the interruption, but that might continue for a little bit. Anyways, mealwood, fantastic. Absolutely worth it. Definitely a usable thing in the early game. If you check out my video on various starts to the game, right, how to start off in a plains biome, for example, I emphasize that mealwood is going to be your go-to. Mealwood is going to be what you really rely on through most of the game, most of the early game, I should say, to keep your duplicants fed. And this is just a staple, right? It's something that potentially you could consume all the way into the late game if you don't require any sort of higher morale needs. Because dirt is just so plentiful. Next up, we have bristle blossoms. Bristle blossoms have a little bit more forgiving of a body temperature range, 5 to 30 degrees, right? Whereas this is 10 to 30 degrees. It's typically not that relevant because typically you're going to be running up against the higher end of that. You're going to have heat problems rather than cooling problems. Same atmosphere requirements. The only real additional thing here is that it requires light, which is not that tricky of a thing to do. Basically put a ceiling light over these things and you're good to go. There's some interesting setups where you try and pack as many bristle blossoms around a single light as you can. I don't recommend these because you care more about the duplicate labor than you care about a light, which is only going to consume like 10 watts of power, but they're kind of cool to look at, so a lot of people use those. The light requirement, by the way, is only required on this sort of bottom tile. These are like 2 tile high crops, but the bottom tile, the one immediately above the farm tile, right, is the one that matters. So if you see any of those cool builds, that's kind of what they're using a lot of time to maximize the amount of stuff that they stick around here. The big downside of bristle blossoms, even though they automatically more or less move you up a rung, right? Here's meal lice, which is pretty bad. And even if you kind of cooked, so to speak, this meal lice into a meal loaf, it would still be morale quality 0, right? These bristle berries start off at morale 0, and just by cooking them at a grill, no other inputs required, you get gristleberry, which is morale +1, and of course you can get them all the way up to berry sludge by combining them with sweet wheat grains, right? And there's also stuffed berry. Yeah, stuffed berry is way up here. So if you have access to Pincha peppernut, you can get them to morale +12. So this is something that can go the distance in terms of your morale requirements. And the real downside of it is that it requires water as irrigation. 20 kilograms per cycle water. Not that bad, considering that it's 1,600 kilocalories per harvest, and domesticated growth is 6 cycles. So it's not a ton of water that you're putting in. I guess the important thing is that water is a very critical resource in the game. It's one of the most important resources in the game. And so until you really have sort of a guarantee that you're not going to run out of water, that you've kind of got that covered, I usually shy away from making bristle blossoms. The other big downside that it doesn't talk about here is that bristle blossoms, when they have flowered, when they're ripe, will produce allergens. And so if you have allergic duplicants in your base, this is going to be a major issue, right? Because the allergens create a major stress debuff for duplicants. They've kind of nerfed how much that debuff was, so it isn't as bad as it was before, but it's still pretty bad. And that's going to be one of the challenges that you have with bristle blossoms. Keeping them away from allergic duplicants is going to be pretty important. But if you don't have any allergic duplicants, like you just decide I'm never going to accept any allergic duplicants, which is one option that you have, then that downside more or less completely goes away. And in fact, there's a little bit of an upside because allergens will actively prevent germs from going into an area, right? So you can have an allergen-coated area, and because there's only one type of germ effectively allowed per tile, the bristle blossoms can kind of prevent germs from getting into an area. So there is a little bit of a benefit to that as well, right? Producing the allergens might be a good thing if you don't have any allergic duplicants. Also, the floral scents are a positive thing for most duplicants. So decent thing to have in your base if you have no allergic duplicants. And again, pretty simple. You can set these up with hydroponic farms so that they're completely automated. There's no fertilization requirement, so you don't need anything going on with that. You can just have the irrigation going on, and works perfectly fine. Light is an easy thing to set up. Again, the main thing is, do you have access to water? If the answer is no, this just isn't going to be a good option. Stick with Mealwood until you can get to something else. If you do have access to water in large enough quantities that you just don't care, then this is perfectly fine. Next up, we have dust cap. Dust cap have been around in the game for a long period of time. They're a little bit strange, but they're one of the better options, and really it comes down to whether or not you have access to a swamp biome. Swamp biomes are where you're going to be able to get slime, and also probably where you're going to get the dust cap seeds. Dust caps have a pretty comfortable body temperature range, again 5 to 35 degrees Celsius, pretty easy to maintain. The atmosphere that they accept is carbon dioxide, so carbon dioxide only, which isn't that hard because carbon dioxide is more or less the heaviest gas in the game, or the heaviest gas that you're going to encounter kind of early game in a non-industrial setting, right? And so you basically want to have some sort of area where the carbon dioxide can kind of pool at the bottom of your base, or just pool in general, and you'll plant all of your dust caps there. You'll want this area to be dark, right? So that's important, which that isn't that hard to make. You just basically don't build any light sources near these. And the only fertilization that they require no water, no irrigation, no anything, but just slime, right? Which you're going to get from the swamp biome as well. And 4 kilograms of slime per cycle is not a lot. You find a lot of slime in swamp biomes, and so you can grow mushrooms for a very, very long period of time. Now, these things are kind of limited in terms of what morale stuff they can get you to, right? If we go to consumables again, right, your basic mushroom uncooked is just morale 0. If you just straight up fry it, it's morale +1. And then you can get a mushroom wrap up here if you get lettuce in combination with it. That requires you to be ranching some lettuce as well, so you need to have access to some sort of saltwater biome, right? But they can't really get you anywhere further than that. And you do need access to other things to even get up there. Otherwise, you're stuck on this sort of +1 rung. So they don't really get you that far in terms of morale, but slime is a resource that you're going to have a lot of. It's not going to be renewable in the same way that dirt is these days, but it's going to be similarly just a thing that you have tons and tons and tons of, especially when you're only consuming 4 kilograms of slime per cycle, right? You're harvesting 2,400 kilocalories over 7.5 cycles. This is a pretty good rate, all in all, for converting slime into food. And since a lot of players will switch away from using algae to produce their oxygen to something else well before they run out of slime, you're going to have usually a lot of slime left over to grow dust caps. So this is a major option that a lot of players will use because it's so easy to set up. It doesn't have much in the way of requirements, and just gets you a lot of food considering the resources you're putting in. Excellent option if you have access to a swamp biome. I highly recommend it. Don't be too afraid of slime lung, especially since slime lung doesn't infect people if they eat food that's infected by it. So you can have your dust caps covered in slime lung, but it's only breathing in the slime lung that exposes them to the germs. And because this is going to be a CO2 environment, it's not going to propagate slime lung anyways. So you have like a lot of, just in the way this plant grows, a lot of fail-safes against sort of the downside, which is slime usually has germs on it, and that can be a bit of a threat to your colony. But germs right now are not much of a threat. I think this is great food to grow. I highly encourage it. Next up, we have waterweed. Waterweed grows lettuce. Body temperature requirements are actually pretty good. I would consider these to be a little bit better than the body temperature requirements we've been looking in the past, because typically it's the hot end that you care about the most. Heat problems are usually the problem with your base, and not the cold into things. It's rare that you have a base that gets too cold. It's more common that you have a base that gets too hot. So water weed is pretty good in that regard. 22 to 65 degrees is a pretty good range. The atmosphere that it requires is water, salt water, or brine. So this is not a plant that's going to grow in gas like all these other plants. This is a plant you're going to need to put a little bit of water on top of. Not enough to drown it, right? But just a little bit. You want a thin film of water over these things. Kind of imagine them like little rice paddies. They require both fertilization and irrigation, and the fertilization is really what kills this. In the past, when they first introduced this didn't require any fertilization or irrigation, and it was absolutely broken. But right now, bleach stone is just, that is like, it's not a renewable resource. It's not something you're going to have a lot of access to. Maybe you have access to like a ton of rust, a ton of chlorine, a ton of something, right, to turn into bleach stone. Maybe you have access to some bleach stone just raw on your map somewhere. These are possibilities, right? But unless you have something like a chlorine vent, you're just really going to have problems renewing this bleach stone in the future. And 500 grams per cycle is not a lot. But using this as like a major food crop is going to start running you into problems, because I don't expect you to have on a map as much bleach stone as you would something like slime, right? So this can be a really irritating thing to use, especially since, unlike the dust cap that we looked before, there was no irrigation requirement. This one does have an irrigation requirement of 5 kilograms per cycle of salt water. Now, it's not a crazy amount of water that we're asking for here, right? Bristle blossoms were 20 kilograms per cycle, and that was 1,600 calories over 6 cycles. The water weed is 4 times as many calories of lettuce over 12 cycles, right? So basically twice as efficient in that sense, and then 4 times as efficient because it's using this less irrigation. So it's 1/8 of the irrigation that a bristle blossom will take. But this bleach stone requirement, coming back to that, is just going to be really hard to meet. This is not going to be an easy thing to do, and even salt water is eventually something you're going to run out of, even though you're using much less of it, because at the moment there is no renewable source of salt water besides like a saltwater geyser. You can't just drop salt into water and get salt water. You can't reduce brine into salt water. There's no options right now for producing salt water. This might change in the future. I expect it to change in the future. I hope it changes in the future, but it's a combination of these two things that you can't renew. On most maps, you're not going to be able to generate more of this. That makes this kind of more of a transitional food, if anything, and not something you're going to want to pursue in the late game. There are big advantages, though, because lettuce is a pretty useful thing. If we go to the consumables, for example, lettuce itself, morale plus 0, but it's what turns, after all, our mushrooms into mushroom wraps. Right? Lettuce is also a component in the frost burger, that sort of ultimate food. So lettuce is kind of important for some of these really high-end things, right? It's what elevates your mushrooms to this really high stage. It's what makes that necessary. It's what allows you to get the best food in the game, so to speak. A little bit of a misnomer again, but whatever. The highest tier food, I should say. So it does have, some usefulness here if you want to reach those really high morale requirements. And I guess as long as you have the bleach stone or the salt water, this isn't that bad of a deal in terms of resources. 4,800 calories for 12 cycles, right? Not bad, not terrible. I'm fine with this. But non-renewable resources as an input, it's oftentimes a deal breaker, and I think this is a really big one here. It's just I'm not going to be able to find more bleach stone on a lot of maps, and this is just going to be sort of a food source that I maybe play around with a little bit, but not make a central part of my base. Sleet wheat. Sleet wheat is getting around that area where we say, you know what, like kind of like with this water weed, if I can find this stuff wild, then I'll harvest it wild and I'll just never grow it, right? And I see a lot of players basically just never uproot any sleet wheat ever, and they'll just let it all grow wild, and they'll go for it that way because sleet wheat is something that allows you to get to a lot of higher tiers of food. Right, so if I go to see the gas range here, sleet wheat is going to be necessary for our pepper bread, right? Sleet wheat grains. It's going to be necessary for our frost buns that go into our frost burgers. Like a lot of people, I think, will still basically say, look, if I want to grow something wild, right, and I want to have that set up, I probably still wouldn't bother with water weed. I'd probably just go to sleet wheat or something higher up like that. The trick to sleet wheat is a couple things, especially if you want to grow it domesticated. The body temperature requirements are -55 to -5. So this is the sort of thing that you're going to find growing in like an ice biome and not many other places. And you're going to need to maintain some interesting temperature requirements as a result, especially since this is something that is irrigated with water. Negative 55 to 5 degrees Celsius doesn't give you a great range in terms of water because, of course, water freezes at 0 degrees Celsius. So you have a 5-degree range where you can basically deliver that water. Now, technically, you can get the water a little bit hotter. And, as long as you're keeping the sleet wheat in a very cold environment, that sort of warm water that's sitting in your hydroponic farm tile should kind of balance out with the cold environment. But at the same time, if it's a very cold environment, you also run the risk of your pipes freezing and freezing that water in the pipes. So your hot water, right, would have to be balanced out very carefully versus this cold environment. So there's a difficulty in maintaining the right environment for this thing, especially given that you have this irrigation problem going on, right? A solution to that might be that you just use farm tiles and have duplicants hand deliver water. That seems a little bit resource intensive though, like in terms of labor. That isn't something I really want to do. Fertilization of dirt used to be the big downside of this because dirt wasn't really a renewable resource. That's no longer the case. 18 cycles of domestic growth seems like a lot, but you harvest 18 sleet wheat grains. So it's a sleet wheat grain per cycle, and each of these sleet wheat grains I think is like 400 calories. It kind of depends on what recipe you're using it in. But the sleet wheat grains are pretty high up there in terms of calories, right? So this isn't that bad. It's a long growth cycle, but you're getting a lot of food for it. Interestingly, this is one of these foods that is planted with its own harvest, right? So the sleet wheat, the seed of the sleet wheat is the sleet wheat grain that is produced, right? And also, this is going to be one of those plants that you can't just eat directly, right? There is no, if we go to the consumables here, there is no just eat a sleet wheat option. Basically what you need to do is you, at very minimum, need to cook your sleet wheats into a frost bun in order to eat them. But a pretty high tier food, and ultimately there are ways to get around this body temperature requirement and set up that system. There's some actually really elegant and simple systems. I might show off one on the channel that deal with this. Really comes down to whether or not you have a mastery of this body temperature and are willing to kind of work with that constraint. But otherwise, sleet wheat are pretty good. None of these are really that onerous of a requirement. Dirt and water are things that hopefully in the late game you'll have in sort of an infinitely renewable supply, kind of like with the bristle blossom, right? 20 kilograms of water per cycle seems like a lot, but once you reach sort of the mid to late game, you've probably found a lot of sources of water. You've probably been able to do a lot of things to expand your water supply. This doesn't seem that bad. And sleet wheat grains get you really high up that ladder in terms of getting your highest tier stuff, right? If we look at, again, the consumables, just taking sleet wheat grains themselves and cooking them, it gives you a +4 morale bonus food. And then way up here, the frost burger requires frost buns, requires that food for to reaching the frost burger stage, right? And then you have right beneath that pepper bread, which is going to allow you, just with Pincha peppernut, to grow really high quality food, right? +16 morale can be reached basically just with this one plant and one other. So pretty good food. Again, some tricks and their farm designs that you'll want to look into, which I'll probably post on the channel at some point, looking at how you would farm this. But I rate this one pretty highly. Next up, we have kind of the cousin of the sleet wheat grains, which is the Nosh Sprout. This is a body temperature requirement of -25 to 0 degrees Celsius. The kind of the upside of it, and also its downside, is that it requires ethanol as its irrigation. Ethanol is going to have a lower freezing point, so you're not going to have the same problems that you do with sleet wheat. This is going to be an easier system to set up, even though that body temperature range is smaller, because you have not just 5 degrees to work with for sending in your water, but you have a larger range. You have basically a 25-degree range to work with for sending in your ethanol. So I think temperature-wise, the setup for Nosh Sprout is going to be a lot easier. The big downside, of course, is that ethanol is not really that easy to acquire, right? You need to have a pretty large sort of farm for trees, a lot of them growing wild probably, in order to really support this sort of thing. You have a whole supply chain in order to produce ethanol. So you're kind of in a sticky situation where unless you find a lot of ethanol just lying around the map, which does occur, there are ethanol pools in the game now, it's going to be hard to keep this thing irrigated in the long term. And even if you found those ethanol pools just sort of lying around, you probably just want to use them for power, right? There kind of seems to be more efficient things that you can do with them. Also, 21 cycles is the domestic growth life cycle. That's pretty long. Wild, it's even longer, 84 cycles. 84 cycles is a huge amount of time to get 12 nosh beans. This is kind of comparable to the sleet wheat grains. Nosh beans are a little bit better than sleet wheat grains, but whatever. This is just like it. In a lot of ways, it seems like a worse version of the sleet wheat grains. There are going to be maps where you don't have access to sleet wheat, but you probably, if you're talking about very, very late game stuff, you might be even just willing to kind of go to some other planet to collect sleet wheat grains, right? Go to an ice planet, collect sleet wheat grains, bring them back, and start up a sleet wheat grain industry. Nosh beans don't get you to the highest tier of food, right? They don't get you to frost burgers. You need barbecue, which is just meat, basically, lettuce, and you need frost buns in order to make those. And so, I don't know. I don't feel like these... I don't feel like Nosh Sprouts currently really have a place in the game. They don't get you to the highest tier of food, and they aren't necessarily easier to grow than sleet wheat. So it's something that's harder to make under most circumstances, unless you, for whatever reason, just have access to tons of ethanol, or just have trouble managing the sort of temperature requirement, which ethanol gives you a little bit more of a buffer for. Unless that's a major problem for you, like I feel like the sleet wheat is just a better option. So I would recommend going with sleet wheat in a lot of these things rather than the nosh beans. That's just me. But I don't really see the use of this plant right now. Produces tofu, obviously. In the micro musher, you make tofu, and then the tofu you can combine in the gas range to make spicy tofu with pinch pepper nuts, right? So tofu and pinch pepper nut. Pretty easy chain there. Certainly less complicated than like the frost burger. But again, just these raw inputs are not that great. Next up, the pinch pepper nut. Or pinch pepper plant, I should say, which produces pinch pepper nut. The main downside of this is the body temperature requirement. So you need to have some sort of hot area for your base, which is kind of a pain, right? You don't want this heat to escape somewhere. You don't want to create like a 60-degree area and then have that cook other stuff. So you need to have like an insulated room to supply all this. You also take a pretty good amount of polluted water per cycle. But you get 4 kilograms of pinch pepper nut, which, because it's just being used as a seasoning, is actually a pretty good amount. And the phosphorite is not really that much of a concern. This is a very small amount of phosphorite, and phosphorite is produced by Drecos. So if you have access to Drecos, you have access to a very easy, infinite supply of phosphorite. Not that big of a deal. Plus, there's tons of phosphorite on the map, and not that much use for it in most bases. So using this as fertilization is no big deal. Some people will still kind of insist on gathering these things wild, right? They will basically not uproot any pinch pepper plant that they find on the map, and they'll always just grow them wild. That's an option. Again, you have some temperature requirements that you need to meet, but if you have these areas like at 40 degrees Celsius, you can kind of get there. That's kind of fine. So they find ways around that. But pinch pepper nuts are huge. Pinch pepper nuts as a spice are absolutely gigantic. They are really just single-handedly the thing that elevates most foods right now to their higher tiers. Right? Pepper bread is just sleet wheat grains plus pinch pepper nut. Spicy tofu is just tofu plus pinch pepper nut. Right? Like these are the things that elevate sleet wheat and Nosh Sprout to these sort of highest tier, superb quality things. They're not ambrosial quality, but that isn't even necessary unless the guy is a foodie, right? The person eating it. Likewise, stuffed berries, right? Stuffed berries are gristleberries plus pinch pepper nut, right? So pinch pepper nut is really, really important spice to make a lot of these high tier foods. And I think at the end of the day, once you've gotten to the point where you care about getting those higher morale requirements, you're probably in such a late game state that you don't even really mind consuming 35 kilograms per cycle of polluted water. That's a lot of water. This is really resource intensive, but you probably are fine with that in the late game, right? You've found a way around your water shortages, and so this becomes a pretty good option. But again, some people will just insist on growing these wild and can kind of get away with it. So if you find pinch pepper plant lying around on your map, a good piece of advice is just don't uproot it until kind of you're ready to build your permanent pinch pepper nut farm with temperature controls and your huge supply of water and all this other stuff. But again, the resource calculations for a lot of these things change depending upon whether or not you can find these plants wild, right? If you can, then I guess sure, if free food is always acceptable, right? It's never going to be bad. But in terms of growing these things, Pincha pepper plant, even though it really has pretty big requirements, these aren't requirements that can't be met in the long run. So I think this is still definitely worth it. Next up is the Dasha Saltvine. This plant, even though it doesn't list it in these areas here, it does consume a small amount of chlorine gas. I think this is like 6 grams per second, something along those of chlorine gas, and that's kind of the killer for this thing. Dasha Saltvine is really interesting because salt, table salt, is the thing that you can add to any meal and increase its tier by 1, right? So potentially you could, I guess, break the game by putting salt on a frost bun, not a frost bun, a frost burger, and get like the highest tier. I don't know what is beyond ambrosial. It technically won't count it as ambrosial. It'll say you got ambrosial food plus you had salt with your meal, right? They're 2 separate categories when it lists what are the morale bonuses that this guy gets. But salt will basically automatically upgrade everything by 1 tier. The real trick here, again, even though that's a really useful thing in terms of morale, is that this ultimately consumes chlorine gas, and a lot of asteroids just won't have a renewable form of chlorine gas. They won't have a way to do this, right? Sand is no problem. Fertilizing with sand, sure, go ahead. This temperature requirement, no problem, right? Negative 25 to 50 degrees, perfectly fine. I'm gonna be within that range pretty easily. But this chlorine gas thing is it's gonna be a killer for a lot of this. You're not gonna have a way to make your salt, right? It's just not going to be a renewable thing. There are going to be ways of kind of making space trips to go and collect more chlorine. That'll be an option. But I almost feel like you're just limited unless you have access to a chlorine vent somewhere on your map. And you only need one, but if you don't have any, then you run into a problem with the Dasha Saltvine. You just don't have a way of supplying the small amount of chlorine that it consumes. So great plant. Very easy to grow. You might not even grow it for food. You might grow this as like a utility plant, right? You might not care about mashing up the salt for table salt. You might instead just want the salt because you want to heat up that salt into molten salt and then use it as a way of dumping heat into space. That's another useful thing you can do with this. But until they change this consumes chlorine thing, there's just going to be a lot of bases that can't grow this, and it's going to be kind of unfortunate. Now on to some of the utility crops. Some of these are pretty straightforward and pretty useful, and you're just going to use them for the sort of applications that they're designed. Other ones have some interesting things going on here. So let's start off with the Oxy Fern. The Oxy Fern is going to be a staple on your forest starts. So it's not going to appear on plains biome starts, and in fact you might need to go to space in order to find these Oxy Ferns. But these ferns will basically take in carbon dioxide and output oxygen. And they do it basically at the same rate that duplicants will, or same proportion that duplicants will breathe out carbon dioxide, right? So it makes a big difference whether or not you're growing these things wild versus domestic, but these are going to be how you support a base's oxygen in a forest biome at the start, because the forest biome does not have access to any algae. So you're not going to be using these algae terrariums or other oxygen producing technologies that use algae to oxygenate your base. You're going to be relying on these Oxy Ferns. You're really going to be gated by how many of these Oxy Ferns you have access to. And the key thing here is you're probably going to grow these wild, at least at the start, and you're just going to design your base, build your base such that the CO2 settles onto them. All the CO2 being released by your duplicants just sort of settles onto them. And if you need to jumpstart this process, you'd use something like a wood burner to just generate some CO2 around these things. That way they can produce a lot of oxygen and keep the air pressure high in these various areas. But yeah, that's going to be the general gist of these things. These requirements in terms of fertilization and irrigation are pretty onerous, honestly. 19 kilograms of water per cycle is kind of a lot. I mean, we're talking about sort of bristle blossom levels. I guess the trick is that a domesticated one of these, I think, supports a duplicant. So basically one duplicant per Oxy Fern can kind of work. Whereas you need more than one bristle blossom per duplicant to supply them with food. But still, this is kind of going to be tricky, especially since in forest starts you don't have as much water as you do in plain starts. That you still have the 3 pockets, but all the 3 pockets are smaller. Dirt is not that big of an issue, and it's a little bit less of an issue even though this is a decent amount of dirt, because on the forest starts you're going to have access to arbor trees as well, and arbor trees are going to be core to making an ethanol industry, and the ethanol industry is going to be core to producing renewable dirt. So even though you have this dirt requirement for just basic breathing, which is going to start consuming your dirt right away, right from the start, and consistently. Even if you can switch away from mealwood, but you can't really switch away from Oxy Ferns right away a lot of the time. Even though that's there, that's not going to be that big of a deal because you started in that biome, you're going to have access to sort of the infinite dirt options really fast. But this water one is going to be a big issue, and I think a lot of the way to use these Oxy Ferns is just leave them wild at the start. Don't bother, and try and jump to another oxygen producing technology quickly. Right, try and go find some rust to strip the oxygen out of, or go and find like a swamp biome to grab some slime, or some caustic biome with some algae. Something along those lines, I think, is what you want to jump to from these Oxy Ferns. I really don't recommend domesticating them. I think you have better oxygen production options. They're just sort of an early game thing for the forest biome starts. Arbor trees, though, are a little bit the opposite. A lot of the early game things that you do with arbor trees are just not that useful. Things like wood burners are pretty bad. They're really just a way of generating CO2 for Oxy Ferns, so they're not really a good power technology. But arbor trees, if planted wild, and it's really easy to plant them wild because the forest biome has access to pips, and pips are these little squirrel creatures that will automatically plant things for you. You can create pretty easily, because of the way that they've sort of set up the entire biome, you can create these arbor tree forests pretty easily and just have wild growing arbor trees supply an ethanol industry, which is then going to generate a lot of polluted water and polluted dirt and things of that for you. So I think wild growing arbor trees are going to be sort of a major meta feature for the game going forward. As long as wild planting is still a thing, as long as pips still function the way that they've designed them, then I think wild arbor tree forests are going to be a huge part of a lot of forest starts. As domesticated things, they aren't that great though. 70 kilograms of polluted water per cycle. Now, there will be 5 branches growing at any given point in time, so you're not just getting 300 kilograms every 4.5 cycles, you're getting 1,500 kilograms every 4.5 cycles, so that's a little bit better, but it's not quite enough to recoup all of your polluted water, right? If you took all of that lumber and then turned it into ethanol and then burned all that ethanol in a petroleum generator, you still wouldn't quite get to the point that you need to cover your polluted water costs. You'd be losing a little bit of water per cycle. And if you're using this lumber for really anything else, like feeding pips or in a wood burner, which is a pretty bad option, this is a lot of polluted water. This is just a ton of polluted water, 70 kilograms per cycle. You're going to burn through water pretty quickly if you have a lot of these trees. So again, this is the thing that I think you want to build. You want to kind of have wild forests for these trees. You don't really want to be planting a lot of them intentionally. You really want to rely on pips and and if they reintroduce them, sort of the wild growth mechanics where you just drop a seed somewhere and then it plants into the soil. You want to rely on that, I think, a lot more with these trees. But given the way that wild growth mechanics work in the game right now, these things are insanely powerful. Another thing to keep in mind, I suppose, is that the surface area for most of these plants is just like too high, right? Or like 3 high in the case of these peppernuts and things like thimbleweeds, right? So most of these crops are just going to be too high. Sweetwheat's 1, right? But like mushroom caps are too high. This thing is actually a sort of 3x3 square. So you want to keep a certain amount of space around it. Keep that in mind when deciding kind of how to set up your things. This is a much bigger plant than it looks like right here, right? It will kind of grow and then branches will grow on the sides. So keep that in mind. Bigger thing than it looks. Next up is Balm Lily. The beautiful thing about Balm Lily is that it has no requirements, even when domesticated. It as long as you put it in chlorine and keep a body temperature high enough, it will grow. And this will allow you to produce a lot of medicines really easy. The Balm Lily flower is an ingredient for a lot of these things. But most importantly, the Balm Lily is going to be your feedstock crop for Drecos. Because this grows with no inputs and Drecos will eat these, you can grow Drecos infinitely, right? You can have as many Drecos as you like, supported by Balm Lily farm tile floors, basically. And the Drecos will come by and just directly eat the Balm Lilies. So really easy, really simple to set up. Balm Lilies are basically like hay, right? I know they have medicinal properties, but that's mainly what I see when I see a Balm Lily. I see just something that Drecos will eat and it doesn't cost me anything to make. So you can potentially have, right, and again, ranching is going to be a separate video, but you can have a Dreco ranch where the Drecos consume Balm Lily, and it doesn't require you any resources, no water, no dirt, no anything to generate plenty of meat, right? You just kill these Drecos, harvest their meat, that sort of thing. So Balm Lily is really important in that regard because it grows for free and because it can serve as a foodstuff to a Dreco. It allows for a certain chain that allows you to have free infinite food if you like. Thimbleweed is hugely important and also hugely expensive. You're going to need a lot of these reed fiber for a lot of different reasons. One is clothing, another is atmosuits and exosuits, and then finally the big one is in the late game, insulation. Insulation requires reed fibers mixed with basically abyssalite and space materials, and the big thing here is 160 kilograms of polluted water per cycle. That's 320 kilograms per reed fiber. Whew, that is a lot. Now, nothing else is really that onerous about this, right? I mean, the atmosphere is basically anything. You can even grow these in water and polluted water, right? So that makes it really, really simple. Body temperature is anywhere between 22 and 37 degrees, which is perfectly fine, right? This is fine. But man, like this is a high price to pay for your reed fiber, especially when in a lot of applications you need a ton of reed fiber. You need a lot of reed fibers to make an appreciable amount of insulation in the late game. And this is the main reason why I think a lot of people ranch Drecos, right? Thimbleweed costs a lot to produce, right? 320 kilograms per reed fiber, right? Wow, that's a lot. And then you have the Balm Lily, which grows for free and produces Drecos, and these Drecos, as long as you set up your ranch correctly, will provide you an infinite supply of this reed fiber. You can shear these Drecos for reed fiber. So Thimbleweed, I rank it really low as a plant. I don't think this is something that you should be farming unless you just have polluted water you're willing to get rid of, which is the case in some bases, right? I mean, for the same reason that bristle blossoms are perfectly fine. You can grow Thimbleweed, and it's a an easy solution. It's an expensive easy solution, right? It's fast, it's simple, it's not cheap. So keep that in mind for Thimbleweeds. Next up, we have Wheezeworts. Man, remember the days when Wheezeworts were just something you put in a flower pot that they didn't require anything? That's gone. Now you can grow these wild or you can domesticate their growth. And I think these might still be bugged where they don't actually consume any fertilization, but assuming that they will work as intended on launch day, and perhaps they work as intended now. I actually haven't tested it out recently. But they will require phosphorite, 4,000 grams per cycle, 4 kilograms per cycle. As with the Pincha peppernut, that's not that much, right? This is fine. And if you pay that cost, then you get the Wheezewort as it worked just before, right? You get 12 kilodTUs of heat deleted, more or less, as long as you put these in a hydrogen environment. If you put them in a less thermally massive gas than hydrogen, then they'll cool down things by less. But in ideal circumstances, a Wheezewort will get you 12,000 kilodTUs of cooling, just a single Wheezewort. And even though you still can't generate more seeds for these guys, right? You can't like harvest them in that way and get ultimately more Wheezeworts, which is kind of inconvenient, but you still can get the usefulness out of the Wheezewort. You just need to either set up an automation system to deliver the phosphorite or have the area be accessible to duplicants, which is kind of tricky because you want to surround this area with hydrogen, but it's doable. And even though you can grow these things like wild, they're still kind of useful wild, right? You're still getting 3,000 kilodTUs out of them. That's kind of fine, right? In a lot of circumstances. You stick them in a sealed room with hydrogen, you get 3 kilodTUs. For something that doesn't cost you any resources, that's decent. I don't know, it's fine. I don't think, a lot of people are like, well, this is the end of the Wheezewort. They call them Wheezeworthlesses. I think they're still useful. Phosphorite, again, is an infinitely renewable resource. Drecos will produce it, and Drecos will eat Balm Lilies for free. So maybe that's just my bias. I'm like, I think these things are still a good deal. But a lot of people will just say, look, I don't care about 12 kilodTUs. I'm going to produce a system that just cools things down by way more. I still think these are a good early game solution. I think you're going to have tons of phosphorite in the beginning. I think late game even, you can use them just as a pinch way of producing some cooling in an area. I think they're fine, but do keep in mind that they don't work the way that they used to. They do require like a farm tile or a planter box or something like that. They can't just be put in a flower pot and grow like that. They do require fertilization. All these things are a little bit annoying, but we'll live with it. They've nerfed all the cooling options. This is one of them. I think it's still decent though. Okay, so that's the full range of all the crops in the game, all your little food options. I guess I could go through just all of the recipes just really quick. Again, stuffed berry, gristleberry plus pinch pepper nut, mushroom wrap, fried mushroom plus lettuce, surf and turf, barbecue, which is just meat these days, doesn't require any pinch pepper nut, plus cooked fish, which is just fish cooked on a grill, pepper bread, pinch pepper nut plus sweet wheat grain, spicy tofu. This is basically tofu, which is made out of nosh beans plus pinch pepper nut, frost burger. This is sweet wheat grains plus lettuce plus meat, right, which has been cooked in a electric grill. Mush fries, you fry up a mush fry. This is terrible, don't do it. Omelets, if you're ranching eggs for some reason, you can make some omelets with them. I guess, sure, why not? This is like something that kind of just goes in with an egg ranching or egg shell ranching farm for steel production. Now that we have access to poke shells, and I'll get to that in ranching videos, maybe this is a little bit less relevant of a thing. Fried mushrooms, this is just a slight upgrade to your mushrooms. Gristleberries, slight upgrade to your bristleberries. Pickled meal, this is an option you have with meal lice, don't do it, it's terrible. Cooked fish, cook a pacu fillet, fine, works perfectly well. Barbecue, cook some meat. This is actually fantastic, right? Doesn't require pinch pepper nut anymore, so this is really strong. You should basically be cooking all of your meat. Frost buns, this is just cooked sweet wheat grain. And then, you know, we can make tofu, we can make berry sludge out of nosh beans and water, or sweet wheat grains and bristleberries. This is also kind of a downside that cooking our nosh beans into tofu requires water. Again, nosh beans, nosh sprouts just seem like a worse version of sweet wheats these days, so I'd avoid them. But there you have it. Good if you have water, great if you have access to a swamp biome, kind of bad because of bleach stone, pretty good as a late game thing, pretty bad, worse than sweet wheat, pretty good, fine if you have access to chlorine, an early game thing, a fantastic thing if you grow them wild, feedstock for Drecos, probably worse than ranching Drecos, and still a decent cooling option. There's a summary of all the crops that you can grow in the game. Hope this is helpful. Long video because there's a lot to cover. It's a very deep game, but hopefully if you're a new player out there, this helps you a lot with deciding what crops to grow, how to grow them, all that good stuff. Okay, cutting the episode here, and I'll catch you guys next time.